his best friend, Henry, in hopes to see Meredith, which is his current love interest. We found out that he can read other people's minds and not having to taste their blood to do it. There's a possibility that something is going on between his best friend Henry and Meredith, unfortunately. We ended on chapter 4, and in the end of chapter 4, we were introduced to a mysterious man who was questioning Edgar, aka Eddie, who I think is either a classmate of Vlad's or knows of him or goes to same school or just knows of him basically. And he was questioning him to see if he knew of him, where he was, where he lived, etc. because this mysterious man would like to find him. So now we are continuing with chapter 5. Otis. Vlad adjusted the sunglasses on his nose and walked up the steps to the school. He was thankful to have Henry with him. For some reason, the bullies kept their distance whenever Henry was around. Bill and Tom moved past them on the steps, but neither said a word. Principal Snellgrove was waiting at the top of the stairs, eyeing Vlad with his little mouse eyes. He twitched his nose, and Vlad chuckled out loud. The principal had hated Vlad since the first day he had been enrolled at Bathory. Bill and Tom had given him a welcoming shove down the hall, and Vlad bumped into Mrs. Cumis, who fell forward and subsequently broke her nose. It had been an accident, of course, but ever since that day, Principal Snellgrove had watched Vlad with his suspicious little rodent stare and twitched his nose distrustfully. Henry smiled as they passed the mouse man. "Good morning, Mr. Snellgrove." Just a little disclaimer I forgot to mention, if you hear weird little, I don't know, I guess, like, similar to like a weird, like, hum sound, or something of that sort, my cat is sleeping on the bed behind me, and, she, makes some weird noises when she's in a deep sleep, so I apologize for that. Principal Snellgrove nodded, his eyes barely leaving Vlad before they'd return again. "You do well to emulate your friend here, Mr. Tod." When they passed him, Vlad suppressed another chuckle. Mr. Snellgrove smelled like cheese. At Mr. Craig's classroom door, Henry bid Vlad goodbye and wandered off down the hall. It was strange having different teachers this year, but they still sat together at lunch, goofed their way through study hall, and walked home together after school. It wasn't as much time together as either would prefer, but it would have to do. Vlad crossed the threshold of room 6 and held his breath for a second, hoping that when he looked at the teacher's desk, he wouldn't see anyone trying to emulate grabbing Mrs. Bell by glaring at him from behind her cat eye-shaped glasses. Sorry to interrupt, but my recording has officially finished. list. Werewolves. Foregoing Mr. Otis's atrocious handwriting, Vlad read down the list. Unicorns, griffins, centaurs, fairies, gnomes, trolls, mermaids, nymphs, banshees, zombies, witches, vampires. Vlad stopped at the word vampires and smirked. It ought to be interesting to hear what the rest of the class thought of him. Well, most of them, anyway. There were a few whose opinions he couldn't care less about. In front of him, Chelsea was snickering at a note Sylvia Snert had passed her. Across the top of the page was scrawled Sylvia's loopy handwriting. This guy is a freak. Chelsea whipped out her pen and scribbled something down on the note, but her shoulder blocked Vlad's view. Chelsea held the note out to Sylvia. Without a word, Mr. Otis slipped down the aisle between their desks and retrieved it. He stood in front of her and unfolded it, reading it silently with no hint of a reaction in his eyes. To Vlad's amazement, he turned and dropped the note on Sylvia's desk, returning to the front of the classroom as if nothing had happened. I realized that it would be a challenge for all of us to adapt to our new circumstances. Some of you may adjust more easily than others. Some of you, he smiled at Sylvia as she read Chelsea's note, may think I'm a freak, while others, his eyes moved to Chelsea, who was blushing brighter than the sun, may think I'm intriguing, hot, some might say. Mr. Otis raised his eyebrows. Laughter burst from the classroom, and Chelsea's face blushed even brighter. But whatever you think of me so far, please try to keep an open mind, and if there is in any way at all that I may be of assistance to you, please don't hesitate to approach me. His eyes met Vlad's for a second, and then moved across the room. Now, as I understand it, you are overdue for a pop quiz on punctuation. The class let out a collective groan. After a coma-inducing lecture on the metric system from Mr. Harold and a blissfully short video presentation in Miss Meyer's biology class on The Secret Life of Birds, Vlad shoved his books into his already full locker, grabbed his sack lunch, and slammed the door closed. Somebody got up on the wrong side of the coffin. Henry was standing 2 lockers down, wearing an enormous grin. Vlad snarled, suppressing a chuckle. That may be the most obnoxious thing you've ever said to me. I aim to please. Henry dropped his books inside his locker. What's going on? Not much. No homework so far. Me neither, but I'm pretty sure old Batty is going to drop a quiz on us. Vlad groaned. Batilda Motley, their 8th grade history teacher, gave the hardest quizzes of anyone in the known universe. That's all I need. I just had one in English class. They headed down the hall toward the lunchroom. Henry's eyes kept darting between Vlad and every semi-attractive girl that passed them in the hall. Vlad ignored him, so Henry resorted to nudging him and pointing. How's the new teacher, anyway? Vlad shrugged. He's okay. The lunchroom was already full by the time they got there, and as they entered, Principal Snellgrove grunted his displeasure. Vlad followed Henry through the lunch line and listened to him ramble about how busy he was going to be over the winter break. His parents had finally agreed to take him and his brother on a week-long ski trip, and it seemed to be occupying most of the free space in Henry's head. Henry looked at the food on his tray with a scowl. I don't care what they call it. This doesn't look like fries for one of his Twinkies. Vlad had refused as politely as he could, reminding himself that while his lunch might be dull, it was better than his elementary school years, when he met his mom in the parking lot for lunch. Drinking blood out of a cooler could make you feel like such a mama's boy. Henry led the way to their usual table near the door. When they passed Meredith, Vlad dared to smile at her, but his smile was fleeting. Vlad fell forward. He clenched his lunch against his chest, and when he hit the floor, he could feel the capsules inside his sandwich burst. Laughter erupted behind him, but Vlad didn't bother looking. It could be none other than Bill or Tom who tripped him, and Meredith was laughing too. He didn't want to know. With Henry's assistance, he stood and crumpled up the red-stained, flattened sack. A round of glob jelly and blood clung to the front of his shirt. He picked the bag up and tossed it into the nearest garbage bin, still grumbling as he stepped into the hall. "Where do you think you're going, Mr. Todd?" Principal Snellgrove wrinkled his rodent-like nose as if Vlad didn't smell very pleasant. Vlad pulled the front of his shirt out for the principal to see. "I fell on my lunch, so I'm going to the office to call my aunt." "There's no need for that. Charge a hot lunch today." Vlad ran the tip of his tongue over his canine teeth and darted his eyes toward the door. "What about my shirt?" Snellgrove snorted and clasped his hands behind his back. "There are only 12 minutes left at lunch, Mr. Todd. I suggest you hurry." Vlad opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when he saw Snellgrove stepping closer to the door, as if Vlad might try to make a break for it. At a loss for polite words, Vlad went back to where Henry was sitting and sat across from him. Henry wrinkled his nose at the stain on Vlad's shirt. "I can't believe he's not going to let you call Nellie." Vlad pressed his cheek against his upturned hand and leaned on his elbow. His stomach rumbled. He laid his head on the table. It was going to be a very long afternoon. There was a crinkling sound as half a sandwich was dropped in front of him. Vlad sighed. "You know, eating that won't help." He lifted his head to a smiling Meredith, who apparently hadn't heard his grumble. "You can have half of my sandwich, Vlad." She blushed as she glanced over at Henry, and despite the deep, calming breath he took, Vlad's heart raced. Vlad tried to speak, but that's almost impossible to do when your heart is lodged in your trachea. Henry came to the rescue. "Thanks, Meredith." Her smile broadened and she turned away. Her skirt swished about her knees. Vlad felt nauseous. He smacked Henry's forearm with the back of his hand, but not as lightly as he'd intended. "What are you doing?" "It's called being polite, dork." Henry unwrapped Meredith's sandwich and took a bite. He swallowed, looking satisfied with its taste. Vlad scowled, wishing for a moment that he was human. "I was going to talk. I just needed a minute." Luckily, Henry didn't ask what he needed a minute to do, because Vlad really had no idea. To Vlad's surprise, his fangs stayed safely tucked into the soft tissue of his gums all through history class and study hall. His stomach rumbled loudly as he entered room 6, his homeroom as well as his English classroom at the end of the day. But his fangs stayed put and the bell eventually rang, releasing him from the oppression that was junior high. Henry had waved to Vlad on his way to another student council meeting, so Vlad hung out near his locker after the bell. Vlad didn't even see Tom and Bill coming before Tom had a handful of Vlad's shirt twisted into his fist. Tom's breath smelled like peppermint, which wasn't altogether unpleasant. Behind him, Bill was huffing up his shoulders and looking both ways down the hall for anyone who might interfere. "What are you waiting for, goth boy?" Tom shook Vlad once before pressing him hard against the locker. Vlad was trying his best not to open his mouth, not for fear of what he might say, but because he could feel a gnawing urge to bite Tom out of spite. He ran his tongue over his teeth and found his fangs poking out, reacting to the subtle scent of blood rushing beneath slammed him up against it again, sending a loud clang into the hall. What? Vlad straightened his shoulders. I said I'm not goth. Tom looked back at Bill, who rolled his eyes. When Tom turned back to Vlad, his eyes were rolling too. You goth, a sack of crap. Don't even know you're goth. Not that Vlad had anything against being goth, really. He'd seen the goth kids hanging around the steps of Bathory High at night, cloaked in black and looking for a way out of a small town life. They weren't so different from him, with their black hair, black clothes, and dark humor. In fact, Vlad secretly wished he would be lucky enough someday to find friends that seemed so like him. Henry was great, but sometimes it was really hard being his shadow. Tom shook him again, apparently not satisfied that Vlad wasn't quivering with fear. But Vlad, despite preferring everything else to spending a moment with Tom, wasn't feeling very afraid. In fact, he wasn't feeling afraid at all. He was feeling hungry. Holding his breath, Vlad pushed with his mind. Then, with a strange, dizzying rush of blood to his head, he began to feel completely irritated. What was this kid's problem anyway? Why wasn't he crying and begging to be let go? And what was he staring at? Tom glanced over his shoulder at Bill, who merely shrugged. He pulled back his vest. One quick punch would do it, and then he could slip down the hall to his mom's waiting car. Mom would be a real pain if he was late for ballet. He hated dance, all those frou-frou boys and the stupid leotard, but she kept making him go. 3 years apparently hadn't been enough. At least Bill didn't know. Bill thought he was going to his uncle's every Friday to learn how to make pipe bombs, if he knew the truth. Vlad smirked and felt his mind pull out of Tom's thoughts. It had been easy. Maybe it was the hunger that made it easy. Without a glance at Tom's fist, he whispered, "You better hurry, ballerina boy. You wouldn't want to be late." Tom blinked. He lowered his fist and looked back at Bill, who was punching his palm and eyeing Vlad. Vlad's smirk spread into a smile. What would Bill say if he knew you were dancing around in tights with other guys? Think he'd be open-minded, understanding. Vlad followed Tom's gaze to Bill, who'd stopped practicing on his fist and was looking at Tom expectantly. Vlad pressed his lips together, despite the gnawing urge to flash his fangs. Tom relaxed his grip on Vlad's shirt and stepped back. He grabbed Bill's sleeve and they moved down the hall, away from Vlad. Bill was whispering questions, but Tom silenced him with a shove. In the window across from where he stood, Vlad caught his reflection. He looked paler, older, and positively fierce. He smiled, revealing his perfect white fangs. It had turned out to be a good day, after all. Chapter 6. Secrets and Sanctuary. Secrets and Sanctuary. Secrets and Sanctuary. Secrets and Sanctuary. Dressed as I am, what do I look like to you? Mr. Otis looked about the classroom. Several students fiddled with objects on their desks in response. Some met his gaze with glazed eyes of indifference. Come on, first thing that pops into your head. A small voice broke the silence. A homeless guy. Stephanie Braun shot her hand up. Her tone was matter-of-fact. A mortician. A zombie, Carl squeaked. Carl was one of the quieter students. Lanky, shy. It always surprised Vlad to hear his voice. Mr. Otis pointed a long finger at Carl. His eyes twinkled. Yes, as you seem to enjoy my unicorn costume last week and my troll costume the week before, I thought I'd choose something a bit less eyes were simply losing focus, so he squeezed them closed. But when he opened them again, the letters were rearranging themselves, moving about the piece of paper like tiny figure skaters. Some of the lines blended with others, forming new letters. Vlad's jaw dropped, and as if on command, the letters stopped moving. Vlad read the new word they'd formed aloud. Vampire. He couldn't do vampire. Fear of the sun, craving for blood, inability to enjoy Italian food, everything that he really was. This was going to suck. Mr. Otis relaxed his fist and leaned in toward Vlad. His smile, kind and warm at the front of the class, seemed sly and twisted up close. A wise choice, Vladimir. I'll be looking forward to reading your perception of vampires. As if they shared a secret, Mr. Otis tapped his forefinger against his temple and pointed to Vlad, who looked quickly back at the paper he'd chosen and read the word once again. Vampire. There it was, in plain English. Could he have misread it? No way. It just wasn't possible. Werewolf and vampire weren't similar at all. You could understand the mistake if the paper had said something like vampine, but werewolf looked nothing like vampire. And what about the moving letters? Had he imagined it? Aunt Nellie would say he'd been under a lot of stress lately, that it had been a trick of the mind, but handwriting couldn't move around on its own. She'd probably be right, but the entire event, imagined or real, still freaked Vlad out. Now, back to zombies. Mr. Otis began as he returned to the front of the class. Any guesses on what their diet consists of? Morning passed quickly into afternoon, and Vlad entered the lunchroom, finding Henry sitting at the table near the window, waving him over. Henry shoved an entire Hostess cupcake into his mouth and grinned. The white filling swished out between Henry's teeth, eliciting a chuckle from Vlad. Squished out between Henry's teeth, eliciting a chuckle from Vlad. Vlad sat across from Henry and slid the sandwich out from his brown paper sack. He bit into the bread, and one of the capsules of blood burst open, spraying the roof of his mouth with crimson sweetness. He swallowed the liquid and finished his meal. After tossing the empty bag and stained, soggy plastic wrap into the garbage, he let out a loud burp. "Excuse me." Henry laughed and offered him a cupcake, which Vlad immediately stuffed into his mouth. Sure, human food didn't help him out nutritionally, but some of it just tasted good. Henry asked, "So when are you asking Meredith to the snowball? It's coming up soon, you know." Principal Snellgrove passed behind Henry and slowed his steps, peering over Henry's shoulder at Vlad. insulting, but supported Vlad's fondness for them just the same. Finish your homework first. Nellie was already across the room when she paused and threw him another worried glance. You don't sleep enough. Aunt Nellie. Okay. I'll see you in the morning. She slipped up the stairs out of sight. Vlad took out the instruction sheet Mr. Otis had handed out and scanned it. Maybe he should get started on the essay right away so that it wasn't looming over him for the rest of the term. Determined to get it over with, he opened his notebook, picked up a pen, and began to write. My name is Vladimir Tod, and I am a vampire. He sat back for a moment, examining what he had written. It had been easier than he expected to confess his true nature, so Vlad tightened his grip on the pen and continued to write. He went into the details of his hovering ability and telepathy, exploring the question of why he had them. With a laugh, he then threw in speculation on why vampires had no reflection and couldn't be photographed. It was a ridiculous notion, as Vlad had never had problems with either. He'd managed to show up in every school photo since kindergarten, and, to date, he hadn't heard anyone on the yearbook committee complain. And judging by the slew of pictures he had of his dad, it wasn't much of a problem for other vampires either. After a paragraph on how stupid people were to think that any living being can live forever, he paused again and wrote one final line. I'm not a monster. I'm just me. 1,000 words had come much easier than Vlad had expected. He read the paper over again and resisted the urge to erase it nearly every word. After scarfing several handfuls of potato chips and drinking a blood bag, Vlad flopped down on the couch and immersed himself in the world of Count Orlok, the creature known in the cinematic world simply as Nosferatu. The movie had just reached the part where Count Orlok is traveling by raft when Vlad's mind began to wander down whatever road had taken Mr. Craig from Bathory Junior High. Rumors at school had echoed the suspicions of both the police and the media. Someone was responsible for the disappearance of the well-liked 8th grade teacher, and no one knew whom to blame. People were saying that nothing seemed to be amiss. Mr. Craig's car still sat in his driveway. His belongings remained in their usual arrangement. His bank account hadn't been touched. If Mr. Craig had vanished of his own accord, he left with nothing but the clothes he wore, and that wouldn't have gotten him very far from the small suburban town of Bathory. Foregoing the rest of the film, Vlad clicked off the television and tiptoed upstairs. Amenti, Nellie's fluffy, plump black cat, rubbed against Vlad's legs. Vlad stroked her soft fur, and she arched her back in response. Nellie had named Amenti after the subscribe.